To my friend from Tennessee, not a chance. So my wife, over the weekend in Springfield, said, I'd like you to clean the garage. And I said, well, I've decided to clean half the garage. It's a compromise. She said, who did you compromise with? That's what we're faced here. Senators Corker and Tester come to the floor and say, we have a compromise. Who did you compromise with? It wasn't with the people who are affected by these debit card fees. No, they compromised among the banks. The banks all sat down and said, let's work this out among us, because we're talking about real money here. And that's their compromise. It's not a compromise. What is this all about? The average person listening to this debate has got to think, what are they fighting over there in the United States Senate, this bipartisan battle? What we're talking about here is something we all kind of carry around in our wallets and purses these days, a debit card. And if I take this card and go to a local restaurant, well, let's use a different one. If I went to a local convenience store and said, I want a pack of chewing gum, Wrigley's, because that's based in Chicago. I want to get a pack of Wrigley's chewing gum. Here's my debit card. And they take the debit card these days and they swipe it and they complete the transaction. What you don't know, but the merchant knows, is he just lost money on that, because it costs more to the merchant selling the good to process the piece of plastic than they could possibly profit on the goods that they're selling. And so you wonder, how did it reach this point where the use of this piece of plastic costs so much? It reached that point because the big giants of credit cards, Visa and MasterCard, said to merchants and retailers all across America, if you want to accept plastic at your place of business, then you're going to pay us a swipe fee every time that piece of plastic goes through the reader. And how much is that swipe fee? Turns out it's 1.10% on average. Doesn't sound like a lot, but it is. The banks that issue these cards receive each month in swipe fees from all across the United States, from convenience stores, restaurants, hotels, charities. If you gave your donation to Red Cross because of the terrible thing that happened in Joplin, Missouri, and used your debit card, guess what? Visa and MasterCard got a percentage of it, the amount that you thought you were giving to the charity. College bookstores, you name it. Every time you swipe these, it ends up generating each month on average for the banks across America $1.3 billion. Each year, more than $15 billion in swipe fees. And what did the merchants have to say about how much they were being charged? Nothing. Take it or leave it, buddy. You don't want to pay the swipe fee? Don't take plastic. So over the years, as you might expect, the merchants and retailers said, this is a rotten deal. Not only is this an invisible charge that we have to add to the cost of doing business on everything, we have no control over it. We're faced with paying the swipe fee or not accepting plastic, and in this day and age, imagine how long you'd last in many businesses if you didn't accept debit cards. So 4 or 5 years ago, I called for a study. What is a reasonable amount to charge? And I was opposed, naturally, by the banking industry. They put out an all-points bulletin, kill the Durbin study of debit fees. They didn't want to study it. All the study can do is put the spotlight on them. They don't want that to happen. So we waited, and last year we had the Wall Street Financial Reform Bill. And I sat here patiently on the floor saying, I want to offer this amendment to finally come up with a reasonable way to regulate this fee, which is not a product of competition and isn't transparent or disclosed. Well, the vote finally came along. And after 25 amendments on Wall Street reform, they decided this vote wouldn't require a majority, it would require 60 votes, supermajority. Okay, I'm ready to live with it. We called it, we won 64 votes in favor of our position. Well, it surprised a lot of people. It sure as heck surprised the banks. They didn't think that this Senate, on a bipartisan basis, would hold them accountable for the fees they're charging on the debit card. So what did we say in the law? The Federal Reserve, a nonpartisan bank regulating agency, would have the authority to determine what is a reasonable and proportional fee for swiping the card. And that fee would go into effect this July 21st, 1 year after we passed the law. And we said in the meantime, anyone who has any thoughts, ideas, or comments, send them to the Federal Reserve. They got 11,000 plus comments. Everybody had an idea. Some of them didn't like the law, some did, on and on. And so they came out with a preliminary report, not a rule, preliminary report in December. You know what they found? They found that the average charge per transaction in the United States was 44 cents, and the average cost to the bank for processing the debit transaction, about 12 cents, about 1/4. So the plot thickens. It turns out that the banks issuing these cards are not only charging this invisible fee, they're dramatically overcharging merchants and retailers, and guess what, Mr. and Mrs. Consumer, all of us too. We pay it. We pay it in additional charges. Even if you go into that store to buy the package of chewing gum with cash, the price has been raised because they're expecting you to give plastic instead, and you pay more. So then the battle was on. Whether or not the Federal Reserve would issue this rule establishing a more reasonable fee, swipe fee, for these debit cards. And it is a big battle. Imagine, if you will, what it means to the biggest banks in America when they have on the line $1.3 billion a month. Pulled out all the stops. A friend of mine who's a lobbyist downtown in Washington said, Durbin, praise the Lord, come up with some more ideas. This is a full employment amendment. Everybody who's a lobbyist in Washington is working on this amendment. We just love you to pieces. Well, the sad reality is it's coming maybe to a close with the vote on this amendment. But the banks and the credit card companies started piling it on. And let me be fair, the other side did too. The merchants and retailers finally said, for goodness sakes, we want fair treatment, and if we have to fight to protect this new law, we're going to fight to do it. And that's where we are today. Senator Tester of Montana, Senator Corker of Tennessee have offered an amendment, which I'm about to describe. This is interesting, though. They are offering this amendment in an effort to stop the Federal Reserve from issuing a rule that will establish how much that swipe fee is going to be. Well, how soon would the Fed issue the rule? Within the month, within a matter of days. They are desperate to get this amendment to the floor to try to stop the Federal Reserve from saying what is a fair swipe fee and to protect merchants, retailers, small businesses, and consumers across America. The banks want to stop them. So there's one other part of this story that's important. We decided when we wrote this law that we would give smaller banks, community banks, and smaller credit unions an exemption. In other words, they're not covered by the federal rule. And you say, why? From a consumer's point of view, all the arguments you made still apply. Well, that's true, but many of these smaller institutions are more financially vulnerable. And I happen to agree with both Senators Tester and Corker. I believe in community banks and local banks, and I want them to survive. So we carved them out and said if the value of your bank is below $10 billion, you're not going to be affected by this. If the value of your credit union is below $10 billion, you won't be affected by this. How many did we exempt? Out of 7,000 banks in America, only 100 would be affected by the law. And out of 7,000 credit unions, only 3 would be affected by the law. But then there's another part of the story. It turns out that the 3 biggest banks in America are the ones that make the most money on debit fees. Each month, they collect more than 50% of the debit fees. What are those banks? Chase, Wells Fargo, and Bank of America. They have been fighting viciously to stop this rule from going into effect because there are billions of dollars at stake. And they don't want that, they don't want to lose that income. So let's have a little trip down memory lane about these banks. Do you remember a few years ago when these banks got us in the biggest economic mess in current memory? Did you notice any change in your savings account? Perhaps your IRA? The money you put away for your retirement? Well, I sure did. I think Loretta and I lost about 30% of our value because they were playing games with subprime mortgages and new derivatives and AIG offices in London, and this holy mess ended up being visited on families, businesses, and consumers all across America. And we were in a panic. The chairman of the Federal Reserve, Ben Bernanke, and the Secretary of the Treasury, Hank Paulson, came and met with us in a room not far from here and said, if you don't do something and do it immediately, banks across America are going to fail and our economy is going to collapse, not just here, but across the world. You've got to come to their rescue. You've got to come up with a bailout for the banks. Remember that, taxpayers of America? Well, how did the big three debit card banks do in the bailout? Chase, $25 billion in taxpayers' money because they had acted so recklessly and endangered their bank that they needed a helping hand. Bank of America, $45 billion in taxpayer bailout funds. Wells Fargo, $25 billion in taxpayer bailout funds. Remember that, taxpayers of America? When the same banks that are going to profit from these debit card fees were so desperate that they needed a helping hand from taxpayers to save their banks? And do you remember how they expressed their gratitude to us? It was heartwarming. As soon as they could, they called a meeting of the board of directors and awarded one another bonuses for their reckless conduct. Just warmed my heart that they were so appreciative of the taxpayers across America sacrificing with their taxes to save these big old banks. Well, I've got news for taxpayers. They're back. They're back today. And now, it's smaller, I'll concede. It's only $15 billion a year, but these same big banks are asking for a handout and a subsidy from the Senate. Are we going to get shaken down a second time? That's what this debate is all about. Because I'll tell you, at the end of the day, if this amendment that's pending on the floor passes, then for at least a year, and I think way beyond it, these banks will continue to bring in $1.3 billion out of the wallets and purses of consumers across America every time a person uses one of these plastic cards. I don't think it's fair. I don't think it's right. I think there is a way to deal with this and deal with it honestly, and let me tell you what it is. Let the Federal Reserve issue its rule this month. They're going to come out with it, and let's look at it. Nobody knows what it's going to say. I've heard both senators who introduced this amendment say, well, this rule, we can't accept this rule. They don't know what this rule is, and neither do I. It hasn't been issued yet or published. At a minimum, shouldn't we wait to see it before we say it's unacceptable? I'm ready to wait. I trust the Federal Reserve will do its job. I think it can produce a good rule, a rule that's fair to consumers, retailers, small businesses, and to banks too. Let me go to Senator Corker's point. Senator Corker said, you know the problem with Durbin's amendment? He just doesn't allow the banks to add in all the possible charges and costs in a debit card transaction. He's just allowing them to count the value of the dough on the pizza and not all the other things that they might add in. No, what we said was you can charge a fee reasonable and proportional to the cost of the transaction. Pretty simple, right? Reasonable and proportional. Well, this amendment on the floor here decided to open the door wide open. It's no longer reasonable and proportional. They have full pages here describing all the different things the banks can add in to establish the fee they charge small businesses and consumers. Are you trusting of these banks to be careful in what they add in? I'm not. And I can tell you that when you look at the list of things that they can include, it includes executive compensation because it's about the cost of the operation of the program. That happens to include a lot of managers and officers as well. And I don't know what else it includes. It is wide open. So here's what the banks have said. Incidentally, I guess it is somewhat gratifying when your name gets associated with amendment and you hear it over and over and over again. Chase, for example, wrote to every person who was a customer in my home state of Illinois and said, beware of the Durbin Amendment. If the Durbin Amendment goes through, it reduces the debit fee charge that we can charge. Your fees are going up. Your benefits and premiums are going down. Here's what Chase failed to mention, and the other banks as well. The total amount the big three banks take in a year from debit card fees is about a little over almost half of the total amount collected. So it's about $8 billion a year. And so the argument that Jamie Dimon and Chase are making is if you cut our debit card fees, well, I'm sorry, your fees are going to have to go up. You know, it's just one of those things. It's the cost of doing business. What Mr. Dimon and others in the business failed to note is that last year on Wall Street, the banks awarded in bonuses, $20.8 billion. So when they argue that an $8 billion loss means fees are going up, oh, really? Or does it mean bonuses might go down on behalf of consumers and businesses all across America? That's part of it. Now, let me tell you a few things about the pending amendment you should know. As I mentioned, it's not a compromise. Second, it includes costs that cover the whole ballpark, that they can start saying, well, we're going to add in the cost of ATM machines to the debit card fees. Pretty soon, get serious. They're right back up to 44 cents a transaction. That's how it's designed. Third, they very carefully wrote this so there's no effective date for the rule. Oh, they talk about 12 months? What it says in here, the board will decide what the effective date will be. There's no effective date for this going into effect, and that is awful. And finally, the arguments that are made on the floor over and over and over again is we just want to protect the community banks and credit unions. That's why we're doing all this. Not a word in here, one reference, take that back, one reference and one trigger to these smaller exempt institutions. There were ways, and they know it, if they wanted to have even more protection and reassurance for the smaller community banks and credit unions. They didn't include them because that isn't what this is about. This is about all of the banks, and particularly the big, giant banks on Wall Street that have at stake in this amendment $8 billion a year in profits, $8 billion a year in subsidies through this amendment and through the second round of bailouts. It's a good test. It's a good test for the Senate. I don't know how it's going to end. I won last year, but they've poured it on ever since. And the banks have done everything they can to reverse what we accomplished last year. It's up to my colleagues now. They have to decide whose side they're going to be on. It's pretty simple. They're either going to be on the side of the banks and the credit card companies or on the side of consumers and businesses across America to give them a fighting chance. How many speeches have we heard on the floor of the Senate about small business? Boy, if we could just give small business, unleash the power of their expansion and hiring more people, we could turn this economy back where it should be. Well, this will be a direct hit on small businesses all across America if this pending amendment is enacted. This is our chance to say to the big banks on Wall Street, if you can have $20.8 billion in bonuses last year, you're doing quite well, thank you. Incidentally, one of these banks had a 48% increase in profits. They're doing okay, folks. We don't need a tag day for any of the Wall Street banks. And secondly, if you do believe in businesses, particularly small businesses and merchants and retailers in your hometown, for goodness sake, stand up for them. Fight for them. That's what they're asking for. That's what this debate is all about. Let's wait till this rule comes out. Let's defeat this amendment. Let's see what the Federal Reserve says. And I have given my word, I'll say it again. I will work with any senator on either side of the aisle if we need to have any kind of reassurance or protection added to what we have done in this law. I'm there. As I've said many times, the only perfect law that I'm aware of was carried down a mountain on stone tablets by Senator Moses. The rest of the time, we just do our best. And if there's a way to improve it, I'll be there. But let us, at the end of the day, finally stand up for consumers and small businesses across America and say to the Wall Street banks and Visa and MasterCard, sorry, this party's over.